This is Part 6, Volume 1 of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. This is Part 6, Volume 1 of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar, read by Roy Schreiber. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Account of John Hamilton, Esquire, who was tried in Scotland for murder and beheaded. This offender was born in the county of Clydesdale, and was related to the ducal family of Hamilton. His parents, to whom he was an only son, sent him to Glasgow to study the law, but the young gentleman's disposition leading him to the profession of arms, his friends exerted their interest to procure him a commission, but the intervention of the crime of which we are about to relate the particulars prevented their generous intention taking effect. Young Hamilton soon becoming connected with some abandoned young gentlemen at Edinburgh, he lost considerable sums at gaming, and going to his parents for more, they supplied him for the present, but said they would not advance him any farther sums while he continued his dissipated course of life. Being possessed of this money, Hamilton went to a village near Glasgow to meet his companions at a public house kept by Thomas Arkell. Having drank and gamed for several successive days and nights, Hamilton's companions left him while he was asleep, leaving him to discharge the bill, which exceeded his ability. A quarrel enfued between him and Arkell, and while they contended, Arkell stripped Hamilton's sword from the scabbard. The latter immediately ran away, but finding he had no scabbard to his sword, he instantly went back to the house, when Arkell, calling him several scandalous names, he stabbed him so that he was instantly expired. The daughter of Arkell being present, attempted to feize Hamilton, in doing which she tore off the skirt of his coat, which was left on the floor, together with his sword, on his effecting a second escape. This daughter of Arkell was almost blind, but her keeping the sword and the skirt of the coat proved the means of bringing Hamilton to juftice. The murderer having gone to Leith, embarked on board a fhip, and landed in Holland, where he continued 2 years, but his parents dying in the interval, he returned to Scotland, when he was taken into custody on account of the murder. On his trial he pleaded that he was intoxicated at the time the fact was committed, to which he was instigated by the extreme ill usage he had received from Arkell. The jury, not allowing the force of thefe arguments, found him guilty, and he was sentenced to be beheaded by the Maiden, to give a description of which instrument may be grateful to our readers. The town of Halifax in Yorkshire having been anciently famous for the manufacture of woollen cloths, a law was made for the protection of the property of the manufacturers, by which it was ordained that perfons convicted of stealing cloth from the tenter grounds should be executed immediately after being convicted before 2 juftices of the peace. Whatever the neceffity there might appear for enacting the law in queftion, we cannot but lament that any Englishman should fuffer without the formality of a trial by jury. The machine by which perfons thus convicted were executed was constructed in the following manner: 2 strong wooden beams were fixed on a fcaffold, and between them, in a traverfe form, ran another beam, to the lower fide of which was affixed a fharp inftrument in the form of a chopping knife, with a large quantity of lead on the upper part. The criminal put his neck between the 2 fide beams, and the crofs beam, being drawn by a pulley, was fuffered to fall down, and the head was fevered from the body in a moment." The Earl of Morton, Regent of Scotland, returning from the court of Queen Elizabeth in the year 1574, faw this machine at Halifax, and had a model taken of it, with a view to the execution of fuch of the Scottish nobility as should oppofe his meafures. But it happened that his lordship was the first who fuffered by this mode of execution, whence it was called the Maiden. After this many perfons of rank in Scotland were executed by this machine, but Mr. Hamilton, of whom we are now writing, was the last who yielded his life in this manner, and the instrument of death is now kept in a room adjacent to the council chamber in Edinburgh. After Mr. Hamilton received fentence of death, his friends made great interest to procure a pardon, but their endeavours proving ineffectual, he fuffered death by the mode above mentioned on the 30th of June, 1716. At the place of execution he owned that he had killed Arkell, but prefumed to think he was juftified on the principle of felf-defence. Mr. Hamilton's cafe will teach us to reflect on the fad confequences of keeping bad company and an attachment to gaming. But for thefe vices he might have lived happy in himfelf, and a credit to the worthy family from which he was defcended. The youth who will devote thofe hours to the gaming table, which he ought to employ in the honeft advancement of his fortune, can expect only to be reduced to beggary at the beft, but in 1,000 inftances, as well as the present, the confequences have been much more fatal. Hence, let young gentlemen learn to fhun the gaming table as they would peftilence, to proceed in the plain path of honour and integrity, and to know that there can be no true happiness in a departure from the line of virtue. Narrative of the Cafe of Mr. Edward Bird, who was executed for murder. Mr. Bird was born at Windsor in Berkshire, and defcended of respectable parents, who having firft fent him to Weftminfter School, then removed him to Eton College. When he had finifhed his ftudies, he was fent to make the tour of France and Italy, and on his return to England was honoured with the commiffion of a lieutenant in a regiment of horfe. Before he had been long in the army, he began to affociate with a banded company of both fexes, which finally led to the commiffion of the crime which coft him his life. On the 10th of January, 1719, he was indicted at the Old Bailey for the murder of Samuel Loxton. It appeared on his trial that he had taken a woman of the town to a bagnio in Silver Street, where Loxton was waiter. Early in the morning he ordered a bath to be got ready, but Loxton being bufy fent another waiter, at whom Bird, in a fit of paffion, made feveral pafles with his fword, which he avoided by holding the door in his hand. But the prifoner ran after him, threw him down stairs, and broke fome of his ribs. On this the mafter and miftrefs of the houfe and Loxton went into the room, and attempted to appeafe him, but Bird, enraged that the bath had not been prepared the moment he ordered it, feized his fword, which lay by the bedfide, and ftabbing Loxton, he fell backwards and died immediately. On which the offender was taken into cuftody and committed to Newgate. He was to have been tried in October, but pleading that he was not ready with his defence, the trial was put off to December, and then till January, on his physician making affidavit that he was too ill to be removed from his chamber. Being convicted on the cleareft evidence, he received fentence of death, but great intereft being made in his behalf, he was reprieved, and it was thought he would have been pardoned on condition of transportation, but for the intervention of the following circumftance. The friends of Loxton, hearing that a reprieve was granted, advifed his widow to lodge an appeal at the bar of the Court of King's Bench, and fhe went thither with fome friends to give fecurity for that purpofe. But the relations of Bird, hearing what was intended, were ready in court, with witnefles to depofe that this was the fecond wife of Loxton, the firft still living. This being the fact, the court refufed to admit the appeal, as the fecond could not be a lawful wife. This affair occafioned fo much clamour, that Bird was ordered for execution on Monday, the 23rd of February, on the night preceding which he took a dofe of poifon, but that not operating as he had expected, he ftabbed himfelf in feveral places. Yet, however, he lived till the morning, when he was taken to Tyburn in a morning coach, attended by his mother and the ordinary of Newgate. As he had paid little attention to the instructions of the ordinary while under confinement, so he feemed equally indifferent to his advice in the laft moments of his life. Being indulged to stay an hour in the coach with his mother, he was put into the cart, where he asked for a glafs of wine, but being told that it could not be had, he begged a pinch of fnuff, which he took with apparent unconcern, wishing health to thofe who stood near him. He then rehearfed the Apoftle's creed, and being tied up, was launched into eternity on the above mentioned 23rd of February, 1719. He was executed in his 27th year of age. He declined making any fpeech, but delivered the following paper to his friends the day before his execution. It will be expected that I should fay fomething at this time as to the fact I am going to fuffer for. I do not pretend to fay I did not kill the deceafed, but humbly conceive that both the laws of God and man will justify felf-defence, which I call God to witness, in whofe arms of mercy I am now going to throw myself. Unhappy is the gentleman who falls into fuch hands, for there was not one evidence for the king that was not manifestly perjured, as I have faithfully fet forth in my printed cafe, with all the juftice of a perfon expecting nothing lefs than death was capable of. And it is alfo as evident that the proper evidences on my fide were never called. I wifh I could perfuade myself that mismanagement did not proceed from the infidelity of my attorney, employed in my trial, for it appears but too evident that he never made one regular step toward my intereft, and I wifh I could aver that he did not arm my enemies againft me. After all this, his Majefty, in his great wifdom, thought fit to grant me a reprieve and order me for tranfportation, but the reftlefs malice of my enemies would not fix here. The pretended widow of the deceafed lodges an appeal againft me. How fhe had a right fo to do, I leave thofe gentlemen learned in the law to determine. Yet this, with her fallacious petition, found entrance to the royal fountain, and turned that former ftream of mercy from me, caufing his Majefty to recede from his firft degree of mercy, and order my execution, under which fentence I ftill, with all humility, fubmit. Another reflection, I am credibly informed, is caft upon me, in order to make my load the greater, which is that I was frequently vifited, during my confinement, and ever fince my conviction, by lewd and infamous women. I cannot fay that I have not been vifited by diverse women, but do not know them to be fuch. Some of them were relations, and others perfons who had bufinefs with me relating to my unhappy circumftances. What will not malice invent? There is one thing more which I omitted in my printed cafe, relating to my adverfary's evidence, depofing that the deceafed Loxon fell without the door, which I declare folemnly is utterly falfe. For what was done was in the room. I was not off from my bed when the accident happened, and when he dropped he fell backwards upon the bed. I might take notice of many more falfe afperfions, but will omit them, having, I thank my God, forgiven them all. In the next place, it will be expected that I fay fomething of my religion. I declare that I die a Proteftant, and of the communion of the Church of England, whofe doctrines teach me to forgive my enemies, which fincerely I do, humbly begging, at the fame time, that all thofe who through inadvertency, heat of blood, or any juvenile folly I have offended, will do the fame by me. As for the manifold reflections caft upon me fince my confinement, the pretended widow's violent profecution, the farrier's notoriously falfe affidavit, and all the other offences committed againft me, I heartily forgive them. And to conclude, I wifh all gentlemen would only weigh the fatal caufe of my unhappy exit, and avoid all fuch houfes where the fcene of this misfortune was firft laid. Let me be an example to them to avoid thofe rocks I have flit upon, that they may, with lefs difficulty than I have found it, be able to compofe their thoughts, which I thank God I have done, through the affiftance of his divine Spirit, and fink into a willing refignation to his divine will. Edward Bird. This unfortunate youth feems to have fallen facrificed to the irregularity and violence of his own paffions, to the pride of his heart, and his love of lawlefs pleafure. Hence let the youth who read this be taught to walk in the plain paths of fobriety and difcretion, neither turning afide to the right hand nor to the left. His taking poifon and ftabbing himfelf to defeat the execution of the law is a ftrong proof of that pride of heart we have mentioned. He could be guilty of a crime deferving of the utmoft ignominy, but dreaded to fuftain it. Humility then is another doctrine to be learnt from the fate of this man. The fituation of Bird's mother in her attending him to Tyburn muft have been dreadful beyond all expreffion. Mr. Bird had been well educated, and ought to have made a different return to the care of his parents. Women in general, however, should confider that it is by a religious education that the mind of the child is moft likely to be guarded from the contamination of vice. The sacred maxim will hold good in moft inftances: train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old he will not depart therefrom. Singular Cafe of Catherine Jones, who was tried for bigamy and acquitted. Catherine Jones was indicted at the Old Bailey on the 5th of September, 1719, for marrying Constantine Boone during the life of her former husband, John Rowland. Proof was made that she was married to Rowland in the year 1713 at a houfe in the Mint, Southwark, and that 6 years afterwards, while her husband was abroad, she was again married in the fame houfe to Constantine Boone, but Rowland, foon returning to England, caufed his wife to be indicted for that crime. The prifoner did not hesitate to acknowledge the double marriage, but infifted that the latter was illegal, as Boone was an hermaphrodite, and had been shewn as fuch at Southwark and Bartholomew's fairs, and at other places. To prove this, a perfon fwore that he knew Boone when a child, and that his, or her, mother dreffed it in girl's apparel, and caufed it to be inftructed in needlework till it had attained the age of 12 years, when it turned man and went to sea. Thefe laft words were thofe of the depofition, and the fact was confirmed by Boone, who appeared in court, acknowledged being a hermaphrodite, and having been publicly shewn in that character. Other witnefles depofed that the female fex prevailed over that of the male in the party in queftion, on which the jury acquitted the prifoner. It is impoffible to defcribe how much this affair was fubject to public converfation at, and long after, the time that it happened, and it would be idle to make any ferious remarks on it. We can only exprefs our aftonishment that a hermaphrodite should think of fuch a glaring absurdity as taking a wife. Account of William Spiggot and Thomas Phillips, who were hanged for robbing on the highway. At the feffions held at the Old Bailey in the month of January, 1720, William Spiggot and Thomas Phillips were indicted for committing feveral robberies on the highway, but they refufed to plead unlefs the effects taken from them when they were apprehended were returned. But this being directly contrary to an act of 4th and 5th year of King William and Queen Mary, entitled, "An Act for encouraging the apprehending of highwaymen," the court informed them that their demand could not be complied with. Still, however, they refufed to plead, and no argument could convince them of the absurdity of fuch an obstinate procedure. On which the court ordered that the judgment ordained by law in fuch cafes should be read, which is to the following purpofe: "That the prifoner fhall be fent to the prifon from whence he came, and be put into a mean room stopped from the light, and fhall there be laid on the bare ground, without any litter, ftraw, or other covering, and without any garment about him, except something to hide his privy members. He shall lie upon his back, his head shall be covered, and his feet shall be bare. One of his arms shall be drawn with a cord to one fide of the room, and the other arm to the other fide, and his legs shall be ferved in a like manner. Then there shall be laid upon his body as much iron or stone as he can bear, and more. And the first day after he shall have 3 morsels of barley bread without any drink. And the second day he shall be allowed to drink as much as he can at 3 times of the water that is next to the prison door, except running water, without any bread. And this shall be his diet till he dies. And he, against whom this judgment shall be given, forfeit all his goods to the king. By an act passed in 1772, it is determined that persons refusing to plead shall be deemed guilty, as if convicted by a jury, an alteration that does honour to modern times. The reading of his sentence producing no effect, they were ordered back to Newgate, there to be pressed to death. But when they came into the press room, Phillips begged to be taken back to plead, a favour that was granted, though it might have been denied to him. But Spiggot was put under the press, where he continued half an hour with 350 pounds weight on his body, but on the addition of 50 pounds more, he likewise begged to plead. In consequence hereof, they were brought back and again indicted, when the evidence being clear and positive against them, they were convicted, received sentence of death, and were executed at Tyburn on the 8th of February, 1723. William Spiggot was about 27 years of age when he suffered, was a native of Hereford, but coming to London, he apprenticed himself to a cabinet maker. He was a married man, and had 3 children living at the time of his fatal exit. He and Phillips were hanged for robbing Charles Sibbald on Finchley Common, and were convicted principally on the evidence of Joseph Lindsay, a clergyman of abandoned character, who had been of their party. One Burrows, a lunatic, who had escaped from Bedlam, was likewise concerned with them, but afterwards publicly spoke of the affair which occasioned their being taken into custody, and when it was known that Burrows was disordered in his mind, he was sent back to Bedlam. Thomas Phillips, aged 33 years, was a native of Bristol, totally uneducated, and being sent to sea when very young, he served under Lord Torrington, when he attacked and took the Spanish fleet in the Mediterranean Sea, near the harbour of Cadiz. Phillips, returning to England, became acquainted with Spiggot and Lindsay, in company with whom he committed a great number of robberies on the highway. Phillips once boasted he and Spiggot robbed above 100 passengers one night, whom they obliged to come out of different waggons, and having bound them, placed them by each other on the side of the road. But this story is too absurd to be believed. While under sentence of death, Phillips behaved in the most hardened and abandoned manner. He paid no regard to anything that the minister said to him, and swore and sung songs while the other prisoners were engaged in acts of devotion. And afterwards, toward the clofe of his life, when his companions became more serious, he grew still more wicked, and yet, when at the place of execution, he said he did not fear to die, for he was in no doubt of going to heaven. Narrative of the singular case of John Meff, who was hanged for returning from transportation. This offender had been taken into custody for committing robbery near London, but as it happened at a time within the limits of an act of grace passed in the reign of King George I, it was not thought necessary to indict him, and he would have been discharged without further ceremony, but it appeared that he had been transported for another crime, and returned before the expiration of his time, wherefore he was indicted for this offence, and on an act then lately made for the effectual transportation of felons, and his person being identified, he was found guilty, received sentence of death, and was executed at Tyburn on the 11th of September, 1721. The following is an account which he wrote between his condemnation and the day of his execution. I was born in London of French parents, who had fled hither for protection when the French Protestants were driven out of France by Louis XIV. I was put apprentice to a weaver. My father, having continued about 12 years in England, went with the rest of the family to Holland. I served my time faithfully, and with the approbation of my master. Soon after I came to work for myself, I married, but my business not being sufficient to maintain myself, my wife, and children, I was willing to try what I could at thieving. I followed this practice till I was apprehended, tried, and condemned for housebreaking, but, as I was going to the place of execution, the hangman was arrested, and I was brought back to Newgate. It was thought that this was my contrivance to put a stop to public justice, but I was so far from being any ways concerned in it, that I knew nothing of it till it was done. This might have been a happy turn for me, if I had made a right use of it. For my sentence of death was changed for that of transportation, and indeed I took up a solemn resolution to lead an honest and regular course of life, and to resist all the persuasions of my comrades to the contrary. But this resolution continued but a short time after the fear of death was vanished. I believe, however, that if I had been safe landed in America, my ruin might have been prevented, but the ship which carried me and other convicts was taken by pirates. They would have persuaded me and some of the others to sign a paper in order to become pirates, but we refusing, they put me and 8 more ashore on a desert island uninhabited, where we must have perished with hunger, if by good fortune an Indian canoe had not arrived there. We waited till the Indians were gone up the island, and then, getting into the vessel, we sailed from one small island to another till we reached the coast of America. Not choosing to settle in any of the plantations there, but preferring the life of a sailor, I shipped myself on board a vessel that carried merchandize from Virginia and South Carolina to Barbados, Jamaica, and other of his Majesty's islands, and thus I lived a considerable time, but at last, being over desirous to see how my wife and children fared in England, I was resolved to return at all adventures. Upon my arrival here, I quickly fell into my former wicked practices, and it was not long before I was committed to Newgate on suspicion of robbing a person near London. But, by the assistance of a certain bricklayer, I broke out of prison and went to Hatfield, where I lay concealed for some time, but at last was discovered and taken again by the same bricklayer, who had procured my escape. Some evil genius attended me. I was certainly infatuated, or I had never continued in a place where I was so likely to be discovered. My father is now a gardener in Amsterdam. 'Tis an addition to my misfortune that I cannot see him and my mother before I die, but I hope, when he hears of my unhappy end, he will keep my children by my first wife from starving. My present wife is able by her industry to bring up her own offspring, for she has been an honest, careful woman during the 9 months I have been married to her, and has often pressed me to go over to Ireland and lead a regular and sober life. It had been well for me if I had taken her advice. I have had enough of this restless and tumultuous world, and hope I am now going to a better. I am very easy and resigned to the will of Providence, not doubting I have made my peace with heaven. I thank God that I have not been molested by my fellow prisoners with the least cursing or swearing in the condemned hold, but having had an opportunity of employing every moment of my time in preparing for a future state. The case of this malefactor is very extraordinary, and perhaps may never be equalled by that of any other. The narrow escape he had experienced from the gallows ought to have taught him more wisdom than to have returned from transportation before the expiration of his time. But one would think there is a fatality attending the conduct of some men, who seem resolutely bent on their own destruction. One truth, however, is certain. It is eafy, by a fteady adherence to the rules of virtue, to fhun that ignominious fate which is the confequence of the breach of the laws of God and our country. The Singular Cafe of Nathaniel Hawes, who was hanged for a Robbery. The fubject of this narrative was a native of Norfolk, in which county he was born in the year 1701. Hawes' father was a grazer in ample circumstances, but dying while the fon was an infant, a relation in Hertfordshire took care of his education. At a proper age he was apprenticed to an upholsterer in London, but becoming connected with people of bad character, and thus acquiring an early habit of vice, he robbed his mafter when he had ferved only 2 years of his time, for which he was tried at the Old Bailey, and being convicted of stealing to the amount of 39 fhillings, he was sentenced to 7 years transportation. But the fentence thus awarded against Hawes was not carried into execution, owing to the following circumftance. A man named Phillips had encouraged the unhappy youth in his depredations, by purchasing, at a very low weight, fuch goods as he stole from his mafter. But when Hawes was taken into cuftody, he gave information of this affair, in confequence of which a fearch warrant was procured, and many effects belonging to Hawes's mafter were found in Phillips's poffeffion. Hereupon application was made to the king, and a free pardon was granted to Hawes, whereby he was rendered a competent evidence against Phillips, who was tried for receiving stolen goods, and transported for 14 years. We are forry to relate the fequel of this tale. Hawes, during his confinement in Newgate, had made fuch bad connections as greatly contributed to the contamination of his morals, and foon after his releafe he connected himfelf with a fet of fellows who acted under the direction of Jonathan Wild, and having made a particular acquaintance with one John James, they joined in the commiffion of a number of robberies. After an uncommon fhare of fuccefs for fome days, they quarrelled on the division of the booty, and in confequence of which each acted on his own account. Some little time after they had thus separated, Hawes, being apprehenfive that James would impeach him, applied to Jonathan Wild, and informed against his old acquaintance, on which James was taken into cuftody, tried, convicted, and executed. By an act of 4th and 5th William and Mary, for the more effectual conviction of highwaymen, the evidence of accomplices is allowed, but the evidence cannot claim his liberty unless 2 or more of his accomplices are convicted, but may be imprisoned during the pleafure of the court. So, notwithstanding this conviction, the court sentenced Hawes to be imprisoned in New Prison, and that gaol was preferred to Newgate, because the prisoners in the latter had threatened to murder Hawes for being an evidence against James. Soon after this commitment, Hawes and another fellow made their efcape, and entering into partnership, committed a variety of robberies, particularly in the road between Hackney and Shoreditch. This connection, like the former, lafted but a short time. A dispute on dividing their ill-gotten gains occafioned a separation. Soon after this dissolution of the partnership, Hawes went alone to Finchley Common, where meeting a gentleman riding to town, he prefented a pistol to his breast, and commanded him instantly to dismount, that he might fearch him for his money. The gentleman offered him 4 fhillings, on which Hawes swore the most horrid oaths, and threatened instant death if he did not immediately submit. The gentleman quitted his horse, and in that fame moment feized the pistol, which he snatched from the hand of the robber, and prefenting it to him, told him to expect death if he did not furrender himfelf. Hawes, who was now as terrified as he had been insolent, made no oppofition, and the driver of a cart coming up just at that juncture, he was eafily made prifoner, conveyed to London, and committed to Newgate. When the feffion came on, and he was brought to the bar, he refufed to plead to the indictment, alleging the following reafon for fo doing, viz. That he would die as he had lived like a gentleman. Quote, "The people," he said, "who apprehended me, feized a fuit of fine clothes, which I intend to have gone to the gallows in, and unless they are returned I will not plead, for no one shall say that I was hanged in a dirty shirt and a ragged coat." Unquote. On this he was told what would be the confequences of his contempt of legal authority; but this making no impreffion on him, fentence was pronounced that he should be preffed to death, whereupon he was taken from the court, and being laid on his back, fuftained a load of 250 weight for about 7 minutes. But, unable any longer to bear the pain, he entreated that he might be conducted back to the court, which being complied with, he pleaded not guilty; but the evidence against him being complete, he was convicted and fentenced to die. After conviction his behaviour was very improper for one in his fituation. He told the other capital convicts that he would die like a hero, and behaved in the fame thoughtlefs way till the arrival of the warrant for his execution, after which his conduct was not altogether fcandalous. He owned to the Ordinary of Newgate that he was induced to refufe to plead to his indictment, that the other prifoners might deem him a man of honour, and not for the idle vanity of being hanged in fine clothes. He acknowledged many robberies which he had committed, but charged Jonathan Wild as being the principal author of his ruin by purchasing the stolen goods. He likewife owned that he had been bafe enough to inform against perfons who were innocent, particularly a gentleman's fervant who was then in cuftody, but he did not difcover any figns of contrition for this or any other of his offences. He was executed at Tyburn on the 22nd of December, 1721. The end of Part 6, Volume 1 of the New and Complete Newgate Calendar.